I'm very happy to be here to also introduce Kathryn Neves, a student in the fiction program, actually, who wandered into my nonfiction workshop a year ago and proceeded to, as one of the other students said, step on some necks. Not that Katie would ever describe herself that way. She's far too humble for that kind of talk. But she did immediately announce her presence with her first workshop essay, a funny, smart, and heartbreaking essay about, of all things, The Little Mermaid. And well, just so much more. Katie took a story that we all know and managed to defamiliarize it and somehow make it new again. Katie comes from a Utah family with a long history in theater. In many ways, she grew up in theater. Her grandpa staged his own Shakespearean funeral with actors and everything. So it may come as no surprise that Katie has a strong background in playwriting. She has an incredible ear for dialogue and character, rendering people with such finesse and skill as if you're watching them come to life before your eyes. Whether it's our protagonist's nosy sister or Brad, her pretentious therapist husband, Katie has the ability to absolutely nail characters that make them unforgettable. Her fiction thesis blurs the line between a novel and a play, but also between genres, making it one of the more fun theses I've been lucky enough to supervise. Katie's writing transports you and has reminded me why I first fell in love with fiction. Mixing a bit of horror, fantasy, and mystery with actual script form, the novel takes us to the small coastal town of Windfall and their downtrodden community theater, where we meet our protagonist, the charmingly prickly and difficult theater director, Joanna Shaw. Jo is a respected New York director who has tumbled unwittingly into a rough spot in life. She has recently lost her husband in a car accident, and she's trying to keep her head above the rising tides of grief, while still working to make the theater thrive. She's staging a production of The Glass Menagerie, but at the same time also immersing herself in a local mystery swirling around the house she has rented, a house that becomes both character and a stage in its own right. Both writing about houses. The novel is populated with ghosts who haunt Jo's thoughts and other spaces who become every bit as real as the other characters. This novel has it all. In addition to charming and exasperating ghosts, there's a creepy house on a hill, a small town theater, a wise old man, and an angry ocean. What more could you want? Please join me in welcoming and celebrating Kathryn Neves.
It's so good to see you all here. Thanks for coming. Before I begin, I just want to say a quick thank you to my chair, Stephen, and the rest of my committee, Benita Blackburn and Brenda Wilmer. I'm also really so privileged to have been studying this program, reading the works of my peers. It's been such a privilege. Everyone's work is so incredible. I want to also say a quick thank you to my family who've been extremely supportive, and to my writing group back home, and Sydney and Karen. They've been great proofreaders and just given me so much to work off of. So, kind of like Stephen said, I was really interested in ideas of hauntings with this thesis, whether real or imagined, just sort of ambiguity in obsession and haunting, and sort of the way that obsession can help kind of blend reality and fiction. And so that's kind of what I've tried to do here. So this is the beginning, very beginning of my thesis, first 8 pages or so. It's called Walking Shadows on the Stage. She saw him on the stage, then the orchestra pit, then the wings. She felt his breath on her neck as he lurked behind her, heard the moist curve of his smile as he opened his lips to speak to her. He was everywhere. He was nowhere. He was inside her. He was beside her. His hands hovered above hers, both familiar and foreign, like a childhood photograph scarred and warped with water. Joanna Shaw squeezed her eyes shut, and when she opened them again, Danny was sitting in the audience, in the darkness, far enough back that she could pretend he wasn't there. She took a steadying breath and turned to look at her actors. They were waiting for her, eyes wide and bird-like, looks of supplication on their faces. Hunger, maybe. An open seat sat at the head of them, some sick folding chair throne, adorned with scuffed corners and the smell of stage paint and desperation. The hell with this, Jo muttered. She turned and walked out, letting the stage door shut heavily behind her. Predictably, it took all of 10 seconds for Sam to follow her. She ignored him, walking out through the backstage hallway and into the empty lobby. "Joe, where are you going?" Joe shook her head. "Not doing this shit, Sam." Sam heaved a sigh and loosened his gray tie a little, revealing the tiniest mustard stain on his shirt underneath. Joe looked at it, then up into Sam's face. He looked stretched, shabby, defeated, with the weary desperation of a mall Santa 2 days before Christmas. "We can't push it off anymore," Sam said. "If we're gonna open on time, we have to start rehearsals now. A week ago would have been better." Jo sucked her lips into her teeth until her mouth was a thin line and stared at Sam, steely-eyed and sharp, hoping he would shrink away and disappear into the fibers of the carpet. And when he didn't, Jo turned around and walked away from him, taking a leisurely stroll across the lobby. "Joe," Sam said. Jo ignored him, perusing the photographs hung artistically along the walls. One photo for each season the Seascape Theater Festival had been performing, which admittedly was not a long time. 10 years in total, 10 photos. A man in Shakespearean garb wielding a jeweled sword all the way down to a jaunty Harold Hill leading a band of white-clad trombonists. She'd only worked here for 3 years, and already she was tired of it. Sam followed her, clipboard tucked under him, discomfort and irritation radiating off him. Jo was pretty sure she could probably see it if she looked hard enough, uneasiness steaming off him in waves like the invisible ripples of summer-heated asphalt. "I know it's hard," Sam said, a little hesitantly. He reached a hand toward her shoulder, seemed to think better of it, and dropped it awkwardly. "Oh, good," Jo said, "then go away." He took a long breath and pinched the bridge of his nose. "Can we just get through one table read, please? You gotta give me something. Baby steps, Jo." Jo glanced through the crack between the double doors into the auditorium. There was a thin stream of light from the bright stage lights that glinted off the half-open velvet curtain. From here, she could see all the way down the carpeted aisles and up to the top of the stage, where her actors sat, waiting, dead silent. Usually, you couldn't get actors to shut up, but not today. They knew all about Jo, knew about her husband, knew that she was one wrong word away from a breakdown. Jo put her hands on her knees and folded herself in half. She breathed 3 long breaths, extended, deep, loud, then pushed a fist into her teeth and screamed. Then she stood and walked past Sam, out of the lobby and back through the stage doors. She blinked in the heady blackness of the wings, brushing past the forest-screened curtain, and steeled herself. Enter stage right. Being under those lights was like looking the sun in its face, at least from what she remembered of sunshine. It felt like at least a century since she felt real warmth. Windfall was a far cry from the land of sunshine and heat she'd been hoping for when she'd taken a coastal job. It was too far north. Fishy, foggy, wet, gloomy. It fit in well with the sort of pathetic, downtrodden aesthetic of the Seascape Theater Festival. Not that she'd tell anyone that. Loath as she was to stay in a town like Windfall, theater jobs were hard to come by, especially for washed-up, has-been directors like her. Her seat, the scratched folding chair at the head of the group, was facing directly into the hot lights, which wasn't exactly a surprise. Jo was nothing if not a spectacle these days. They all wanted a good look at her. Wordless, she grabbed the back of the chair and dragged it through the middle of the group, relishing the screech and scrape of the legs on the painted stage. She left a satisfying, ugly gray streak behind her. Jo flipped the chair around, facing away from the light, and sat down heavily. She knew what she looked to them now, shrouded and indistinct, shadowed against the halo of yellow light, faceless and anonymous. Relishing in it, knowing it was an illusion, she stared around at her actors. A pathetic group they made, childish and uncertain, looking at her like she was their mother, or like she was a vase about to drop off a shelf and shatter into a million pieces. Sam followed her back through the stage doors, looking some mixture of apprehensive and relieved, and moved his seat until he was sitting next to her. Then he handed her a binder and gave the actors a little wave. "Okay, folks, thanks for being here. Why don't we start with some introductions? I'm Sam." Jo tuned him out, instead focusing her attention on the 4 actors in front of her. Her binder listed their names and the roles they'd been given. Ordinarily, she was the one who cast actors, but Sam had taken charge while she was in the hospital, and these were the stellar recruits he drummed up. The woman next to her, Stella Mackenzie, was going to play Amanda. Jo squinted at her. She looked right for the part, the precise balance of misery and promise in the wrinkle lines around her mouth. Then the man sitting on the other side, a short, hairy man in at least his 40s. She glanced at the cast list. This was Robert Fisher, cast as Jim. That was a choice. Leave it to Sam to cast a middle-aged man to play a 24-year-old. I'm the co-artistic director, along with Joe here, Sam was saying. I'm also the HR rep and the marketing specialist. Oh, and I sometimes run concessions during intermission. He waited for them to laugh, or at least smile. When no one did, he cleared his throat uncomfortably. Anyway, I'll be your stage manager for this production, so if you need anything and Joe's busy, I'm your guy. Next was a young woman sitting directly across from her, Bea Harrison. Bea was staring at Joe, mouth slightly open, eyes shining and wide, not even the smallest pretense of listening to Sam. She'd be playing Laura then. Truth be told, this girl looked wrong for the part. Laura called for a plain girl, someone shrunken into herself, someone soft and uncertain and crushed. Bea's staring was incredibly off-putting. Jo crossed her legs and narrowed her eyes, glaring at Bea until she finally dropped her head. Maybe she could play Laura. The last actor, Arthur Whittle, was staring attentively at Sam, nodding thoughtfully, even writing notes every so often. Kiss ass. He was the one actor Jo recognized from last year. Most actors used Windfall as a stepping stone. It was one of the smallest regional theaters in the country, so it was easy to land a job, easier to move on from it. Actors and technicians passed by like insects through a screen window. It was only people like Jo who got trapped here, and freaks like Arthur who seemed to like it. He'd be playing Tom, the role that Danny was supposed to play this summer. The role that brought Danny out to Windfall, to the slick, rainy road and the screaming match in the car. And suddenly Danny was standing behind him. He looked down at the script in Arthur's hands and opened his mouth to read the lines. But before he could, he caught Jo's eye. He straightened, his mouth curling into a smile, and took a few steps toward her, languid and unbothered, head tilted in the way that he sometimes looked at her, like he was sizing her up, taking her apart, running his eyes over her skin like hands, searching and caressing and gentle and harsh and possessive most of all. Jo's throat constricted, like an invisible fist had closed around it. She closed her eyes again, and when she opened them, Danny was back in the audience, staring at her. Jo, you want to introduce yourself? Sam said. Jo took a long breath, trying to rein in the desire she had to strangle him. I'm Joanna. They all waited for her to say something else, but Jo stayed silent. She glared around at them all, legs crossed tightly, body folded in on itself like she was an origami crane. Each one of them seemed to shrink under her gaze, and she relished in the strange rush of power. Right, Sam said wearily. She's Jo. Bea was staring at Jo the way one might stare at a drunken celebrity, like a train wreck if there was a difference. Her mouth was open slightly, like she'd forgotten to close it, and her head shook back and forth in amazement. Jo wondered briefly how much torment it would take before Bea decided to quit the show. As though she'd suddenly realized she was staring, Bea cleared her throat and shook herself. I think I speak for everyone here when I say, we're sorry for your loss, she said. Jo stiffened. Sam sighed. Let's just move on. Yeah, Arthur said, nodding sincerely. Daniel was a good man. Jo said. Bea leaned forward in her chair. Her eyes were bright, her lips moist like her mouth was watering. I saw him in the company revival last year. He was amazing. The corner of Jo's mouth twitched up, like a fisherman tugging at a line. His mistresses thought so, she said. Silence buried the theater, like snow thumping off a rooftop. Okay, Sam said, moving on. A little more about Jo. She's been artistic director here for 3 years. We were lucky enough to steal her from the Hell's Kitchen Playhouse a while back. Jo couldn't prove it, but she had suspicions that Danny had something to do with her firing from that particular job. Either way, he pulled some strings to get her the job out here. It all felt so orchestrated. It'll be a better fit, he'd said, and working in the same town as your sister, you'll love it. Never mind, it was all the way across the country from where Danny was networking, where he was growing and preening and moving and acting and living, and Jo was out of his way. Jo is usually involved with a casting process, Sam was saying. Obviously, though, extenuating circumstances this year. I heard you're great, Jo said, which was a lie. Let's get started. The actors all flipped open their scripts, highlighters and pencils tucked behind the ears, and began the read-through. Jo had her pen poised at the top of her script. She watched the ink slowly drip onto the page, like a glowing blossom of black blood oozing and bubbling. The Glass Menagerie. She picked out the show almost a year ago. Sam told her to pick something thoughtful, something a little melancholy with a small cast. And when Jo told him about it, Danny had suggested this play. I've never played Tom before, he'd told her on their nightly FaceTime. Do it and maybe I'll come out to Windfall, be a guest performer for a season. Your theater could use the help, right? So it was decided. Joe would do Menagerie, Danny would come out to Windfall as a guest star, and they'd live like a real married couple again, at least for a little while. Joe spent months preparing notes, formulating ideas, crafting a vision that was so perfect, so careful, so quintessentially Danny. Menagerie was going to be her frame, and Danny would create the painting, just like their college days, their LA days, and their Chicago days, and their New York days. The play is memory, Arthur read. Being in a memory play, it is dimly lighted, it is sentimental, it is not realistic. Jo sketched a minuscule glass unicorn in the margins of her notes as she listened to him read. He was, Jo was loath to admit, good, really good. There was a sincerity in him, a sort of tender simplicity, more subtle than she expected. When she looked up from her drawing, Danny was sitting where Arthur was. He was reading those lines with that sardonic wit, his needle-sharp voice, possessing and puppeteering the character, embodying it like he'd swallowed Tom whole, the way he swallowed each role he'd ever played. Being an emissary from a world of reality that we are somehow set apart from, Arthur read, Danny read. But since I have a poet's weakness for symbols, Jo scratched out the unicorn, meticulously covering it in cross-hatching black ink lines until there was a gaping black hole staring up at her, a void that hungered and itched and readied itself to stretch beyond the paper, to eat the script and Jo's hands and the stage and the theater and the whole damn town. Thank you.